In this video, we want to talk about reproduction. So here are some big questions that you want to be able to answer. We want to focus on the sexual reproduction, but you also want to compare some of the similarities and differences between sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. And you want to focus on the animal and the plants and how the reproductive systems are similar and how are they different. Remember that plants and animals' reproductive system did not develop at the same time. However, there are a lot of similarities. So here we have first asexual and versus sexual. Asexual reproduction. Some examples are mitosis, binary fission, which is for bacteria, and there are also fungus and yeast and what else? Protists that are able to do asexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is when you combine two of the haploid cells to get together in order to form a diploid cell. But depending on what kind of organism it is, the dominant stage of the organism could either be haploid or diploid. And here is you can see that for asexual reproduction, one female can really grow the population really fast and do it all by herself, and that's a really good thing in a way because you can develop the population really fast, and the goal for any organism is to survive and reproduce. So this is great for reproduction. However, for asexual reproduction, the survival part could be a little challenging. As the environment changes, or if there's a predator or a lot of competition, all of these identical individuals might die all at the same time, but sexual reproduction can produce individuals with a lot of genetic variations to make certain individuals potentially more fit for the environment in order for the species as a whole to pass on their genes. Here's a brief review of sexual life cycle. As you can see, well, you don't really need to know all the details of how this works, and you really don't even have to look at these graphs, but it kind of gives you a sense on how a life cycle works, so which you might be asked to look at. So here's an example. For animals, most of the animals have a 2N diploid stage that's dominant. That's a dominant stage of the organism, and that's the organism right there. It can go through meiosis and produce a gamete, which is a haploid cell. The haploid cell can fuse with another haploid cell and go through fertilization in order to form a zygote, and then the zygote develops into a whole organism again. Here's an example for plant and some algae. For this particular plant, the dominant stage of the plant is the sporophyte stage. The sporophyte stage is the 2N stage of the plant, and it can go through meiosis in order to form the spores, which is a haploid cell. This haploid cell can then turn into a gametophyte by going through mitosis. Gametophyte is not the dominant stage of this particular plant, but the gametophyte is also a part of the plant. And then this gametophyte can go through mitosis again in order to produce a gamete, and this gamete can be fused with another gamete in order to go through fertilization, in order to produce seed or whatever it is of a zygote. Then this zygote can develop into a full plant again. And here's an example for fungi and some protists. For most fungi and protists, their dominant stages are the N stage, the haploid stage. And this haploid stage, well, the whole organism is in the haploid stage, but a part of the organism is able to produce gamete by going through only mitosis. And then this gamete can attract a different gamete, either from the same body, if it's a hermaphrodite, or a different individual, if the two individuals have the male and the female, or sometimes the two individuals can turn into a male or a female, depending on what the other individual is. Or some of the times they could be both, and it could be all different kinds of ways. But anyway, we can have two haploid cells fuse and get fertilized and produce a zygote, and then the zygote goes through meiosis, and then and then a haploid cell is formed in order to develop into the full organism. So if you compare all three of these life cycles, you can see that there are different stages of haploid and diploid, and for different organisms, they could either have the dominant haploid stage or a dominant diploid stage. So it all depends. We want to first start with fungi, mostly N, occasionally 2N. A classic example is mushrooms. So some mushrooms can fertilize itself. Some mushrooms or some other fungi have to depend on another fungi in order to get fertilized. So over here you can see these windy structures, these silky structures, and these are all spore-producing structures, which means they can produce spores, which are diploid, and those can develop into another mushroom. And here's a more typical example for fungi. As you can see, there are these structures on the top that can produce spores, and those spores can develop into new fungi. And then here's the next one. Here's a general fungal life cycle. You start with a certain fungus. It can go through an asexual reproduction where the spores are produced and then it develops into the same fungus, or it can go through the sexual reproduction stages where it goes through plasmogamy. Plasmogamy is when two haploids, you can see this is haploid, when two haploid fungus have their cytoplasm fused together in order to form a diploid stage. So during this transitional stage, we get to eventually we get to the diploid stage, which is the zygote, and then the zygote goes through meiosis, which produces haploid spores, and haploid spores develop into the fungus again. Here are some actual examples of fungus, and you can take a look at that on your own. Now we're moving on to animals. Animals are mostly 2Ns. There are very many different types of sexual behaviors that can be done, but this one is kind of interesting. This one is a lizard. This lizard have sexual behavior, which means two lizards have to interact in order to allow the reproduction process. However, this reproduction process is actually asexual reproduction, and how it works is that even though there's a female and a male-like individual interacting, in the end, it's really a female making a copy of itself, of another female. So then the new lizard that's produced is the same as the original female. And during this whole process, you can see these different types of, well, estradiol and progesterone, those are two reproductive hormones going up and down and allow the female to reproduce. And this next one is fertilization can also happen internally and externally. If it happens internally, most of the time it's because the external environment is not very suitable for the eggs to be in the environment outside the body. So the good thing of carrying the eggs inside the body is that the parents are protecting the eggs. However, this process also requires a lot of energy. So the process of holding those eggs inside the body also requires a lot of energy. So it's kind of a trade-off. Do you want the eggs to be more protected, or do you want to save energy in order to produce more eggs, more fertilization later on? And so that's a trade-off. And there's also the trade-off of parental care, because caring for the offspring wastes a lot of energy, but at the same time, caring for the offspring might increase the survival rate of the offspring. So eventually different organisms, different species develop their own mechanism of child rearing and caring and reproduction to allow them to be most fit for the environment. And for human reproductive system, you'll be able to watch all of that in the videos, so I'm not going to go through it too much. And but over here, we want to talk about the hormones real quick. Spermatogenesis is the process of producing sperms. And as you can see, these three hormones are really important: GnRH, FSH, LH, and testosterone, of course. All of these hormones are able to interact with each other and produce positive and negative feedback. So this is a direct feedback. However, over here we have a negative feedback loop. We have a negative feedback loop over here, negative feedback loop over here, in order to produce these sperms. But once the sperms are produced, then this process will stop. And then let's skip over here. Let's skip this picture. This picture is showing you that with when a boy is born, there are all these 2N cells, those spermatogonial stem cells that are able to produce sperm at some point, but those really just go through mitosis again and again until puberty hits, and then the 2N cell is going to go through mitosis. No, it's going to go through meiosis over here and produce the 4 sperm cells. So as you can see, if this cell keeps on producing more and more 2N cells and eventually produce all those 1N cells, there's going to be a lot of those sperms. And that's really kind of a good thing, because that's more energy efficient than producing eggs. But here's the eggs. We're going to first take a look at these pictures on how hormone is used for the production of egg. We started the hypothalamus as well. That's the hormone control center of the brain. And there's inhibitors and stimulators all throughout. So there's estradiol and progesterone can inhibit the production of GnRH. However, if you have a really high level estradiol, then you would stimulate the production of GnRH. However, if you have a low level of estradiol, it will inhibit the production of FSH and LH. And just like the production of sperm, SH and LH and FSH go up and down during the process of producing the egg, and as you can see, the LH and FSH level are relatively low when an egg is not being fertilized, but when it goes really high, that's when the ovulation happens. So that naturally happens every month for females. And this ovulation allows this egg cell to come out to the fallopian, go through the fallopian tube and go into the uterus. And during this time, after this time, the natural LH level is going to go down a little bit and then go up a little bit again. Estradiol is going to go up, and progesterone is going to go up over here. And the mixture of estradiol and progesterone is going to allow the formation of the extra tissues at the uterus, so that if the egg gets fertilized, it would be able to attach itself to this part of the uterus. Contraception, you don't have to go into too much detail over here. Basically, there are different stages of spermatogenesis and oogenesis, which is oogenesis is the production of egg, spermatogenesis is the production of sperm. It's pretty easy, as you can see in the name. And during each one of those processes, you can have a certain contraception in order to prevent someone from getting pregnant. So it can happen both on the female side and the male side, depending on what exactly is going on. The next one is cloning. We've talked about cloning before, so I'm not going to go through it. So please take a look at this picture and make sure you understand how cloning is done. And then there's the stem cell. Remember, potency is different for different types of stem cell. The embryonic stem cell is has the most potency, which means it can become any type of cell it wants, basically, depending on what kind of signal it receives from other glands. And then there's the adult stem cell that can produce certain types of cells, but it doesn't have as much potential as the embryonic stem cell. Now we're on to plants. Plants sex is analogous to animal sex, so they're not exactly the same. It says not homologous, meaning that the planned reproduction system did not come about because they're very similar to, did not come about as the animals because they had a common ancestor. Yes, plants and animals do have a common ancestor, but the mechanisms did not develop from the same common ancestor. So plant develop its own reproductive system, animals develop its own reproductive system, and it all developed because um, of evolution, whatever works the best for the environment, basically. So as you can see, for this plant, it has an alternation of generations. Again, you don't have to know the details, but just having a general understanding on how the alternation of generation works is good enough. For this plant, we have a sporophyte. Well, this is a fern. So the sporophyte, which means is the 2N stage, the diploid stage, is the main dominant stage for this plant. Once it goes through meiosis, it will produce spore, just like fungus do, and then this spore can then be turned into a gametophyte, which is the haploid stage of a plant. And this gametophyte is still a part of the plant, and then this gametophyte can go through mitosis again, get fertilized, and then become another 2N zygote and develop into another plant. However, not all plants work this way. Over here, it shows you asexual reproduction can happen for aspen trees, and then sexual reproduction actually developed, co-evolved with certain pollinator insects, having those pollens and flowers really gave plants more potential to have more variations in the nature, right? Because if you're mixing up different pollens, then we get more genetic variations, which means that if there's a certain insect that keeps on feeding on certain plant, but there's one plant that developed a certain mechanism to fight off those insects, then they are more fit for the environment, and then they get to survive and reproduce, and they evolve into a whole different species. So being able to do sexual reproduction for plants give plants a lot more potential to evolve and make them potentially more fit for the environment. So make sure you understand the connection between reproduction and evolution. As always, is evolution. Over here, it's a little hard to see, so you might want to zoom in a little bit when you're looking at it as well. This one just shows you that different types of plants have different dominant stages. For the mosses and other non-vascular plants, the gametophyte is the dominant stage. For ferns and other seedless vascular plants, the sporophyte is the dominant stage. And then for seed plants, gymnosperms and angiosperms. Gymnosperms are plants that can produce seeds. Angiosperms are plants that can not only produce seeds, but can also produce flowers. And those seed plants have a dominant stage of sporophytes. Remember, gametophyte is kind of easy to remember. Gametophyte, gamete, that's a haploid stage. Sporophyte is the other one. It produces spores. Spores is also diploid, and sporophyte is the diploid stage. Okay, and you can take a look at these pictures as well. And here's an example of a life cycle of a gymnosperm. We have this tree right here. We have the pollen cone and the ovulate cone. The ovulate cone is the female reproductive organ of the tree, and this is the part that produces pollen, which is the male reproductive organ. And then eventually the ovule and the pollen grains fuse in order to produce seeds, and then the seeds can grow into another tree. So this is an example that of a tree that has a dominant sporophyte stage instead of a gametophyte stage. And then this next one is an angiosperm. An angiosperm has flowers, And a perfect flower has both pollen and the ovule, but not every flower has both. Some flowers can only have one, some flower can have both, some flower can have certain flowers that have one, certain flower has two, and some flowers have to depend on another complete different plant in order to get to get both the pollen and the ovule. But over here we have the fertilization process where the egg and the sperms are haploid and they get to fuse inside the flower, and then eventually a seed is produced. The seed can germinate, make another plant, make more flowers. It's a whole circle, a whole cycle of life. And here's a floral anatomy. We already went through this in class before. You had a picture to label. Make sure you know these different parts and what they do for the reproduction of a flower or a flowering plant, angiosperm. And then this next one is kind of showing you how the sperm and an egg for a flowering plant, angiosperm, works. We can first start with the sperm. You first start with a microsporocyte, which is the kind of the pre-sperm cell, and then it divides into 4 microspores, but only 2 of those microspores actually end up being used, end up in the mature pollen grain. So within each pollen grain, there are only 2 of those sperms, which is kind of strange because usually you have 1 sperm, but here we have 2 sperms. Both of those sperms will go down the tube into the ovule where the egg cell stays. But it's also interesting for the egg cell that instead of only having 1 egg cell, by the time the egg cell mature, there's also the egg and the polar nuclei, which is a diploid cell. Okay, and then the sperm, the 2 of the sperms, it is going to fuse with the egg and the polar nuclei, and eventually you're going to have a diploid because egg is 1 end and plus the sperm is 1 end. You'll get a 2 end, and then for the polar nuclei you will have a 3 end that's going to form some protective layers and nutrients for the flower, and then for the seeds that's going to be produced later. So the 3M part I was talking about is also called the endosperm. These are all mentioned in the videos that I asked you to watch as well. Here are some pollinator adaptations. There are different ways that different plants get pollinated, and they all evolved depending on what's the most fit for the particular environment that they live in. So as an example, the flowers can be have really pretty colors because those colors are recognized by pollinators, and both the pollinators and the flowers get to benefit from their relationship. And here's a coevolution. There are certain other organisms, bees. Where's the bees? Oh, here's a bee. That's a fly. Flies, bees, birds, hummingbirds, even bats. They all co-evolved those mechanisms in order to recognize flowers, in order to get the honey, and then it's also good for the plants. So it's kind of a co-evolution process because the pollinator's ability to pollinate and the flower's ability to be pollinated kind of happen around the same time because they have to depend on each other. None of those can survive on its own. This next one is some flowers can also, some flowers are okay with self-pollination, but in order to create more diversity within the population, some flowers also have mechanisms to prevent self-pollination. So you can take a look at this. Here's a double fertilization where we talk about the 2 sperms coming in and fertilizing the egg as well as the polar nuclei. And then here's the seed development. Here's fruit development. Here are some other seed dispersal mechanism in order to have the seeds go to other places, and in order to get more individuals within the population. And here's germination. We'll kind of talk about this as well. We have most of the seed is actually just nutrients for the development of a plant, and the nutrients and the zygote won't start interacting with each other until the environment is right, is suitable. And here's monocot versus dicot, which are also mentioned in the videos. And here's cloning of plants. It's really easy. You can just get a part off of it and put it somewhere else, because there's a stem cell within a plant all over the plant, especially towards the bottom and the top of the plant. And that's it. Here are some questions that you need to be able to answer. Make sure that you take a look at those.